Coming up from Call to Mind, Black girls and women describe some of the daily challenges they face in the United States.
Very young, I understood that my skin color was frowned upon. So then as you become a woman, then you realize, wow, I have a double whammy. I'm a woman and I'm a Black woman.
And how everyday encounters with racism, microaggressions, and stereotypes impact their mental health and well-being.
There's a strong correlation between racism and sexism and Black women's overall mental health. Black women, compared to their white female peers, are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health issues like anxiety and depression. All of these factors can lead to a grieving heart.
I'm Kimberly Adams. Join me for The Burden of Being. We'll explore the unique mental health concerns of Black girls and women in the United States. Over the coming hour, The Burden of Being. First, the news. You're listening to The Burden of Being, a broadcast special from Call to Mind, American Public Media's initiative to foster new conversations about mental health. I'm Kimberly Adams.
So very young, I understood that my skin color was frowned upon, not necessarily accepted. So then as you become a woman, then you realize, wow, I have what's considered, quote unquote, a double whammy. I'm a woman and I'm a Black woman. So I felt like in my journey that I've always had to maybe prove myself, because sometimes the narrative would be, well, because, you're Black or you're a Black woman, you can't possibly be that intelligent or have the means or what have you. So I know a big part of my life, there's been a time in my journey where I felt like I needed to prove myself.
That was Andrea. She lives in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Andrea is just one of many people we heard from when we asked Black women to share their stories. And while I can tell you personally, there is much joy in being a Black woman, these women told us about the daily experiences of microaggressions and discrimination.
Because we can't not be Black. And my children can't hide their Black when they're out.
How routine events like an interaction with a sales associate or a problem at work can carry extra layers of tension or even dread.
We live in a sense of fear all the time because we are afraid of being called lazy. We're stressed more often than not. We overwork, overcommit.
Many women said that when they respond a certain way, which might be considered normal for women of another race, they're perceived as angry, hostile, or even violent.
Right after giving birth, it was a tough delivery. A younger Black woman came into my birthing room and she said, I just wanted you to know that they sent me in because they said you were a difficult patient.
Over and over, we heard about how these daily realities have real mental health consequences, like anxiety, PTSD, depression, and grief.
It can be mentally, emotionally, and spiritually exhausting. And it feels like folks don't get it. And even the folks that seem to get it, there still seems to be something that they're not getting that, has sent me in moments deep depression, to be honest.
Every Black woman, myself included, has had dozens of moments when they had to swallow indignities and disrespect or risk an outsized consequence. The stress of this constant calculation can wear on our physical bodies and mental health.
We as Black women are always expected to hold it together, to figure things out, to the point that we self-sacrifice.
This is The Burden of Being. And over the next hour, we'll explore the unique challenges faced by Black girls and women in the United States. We'll hear how racism impacts mental health, and we'll look into solutions that could better help Black girls and women thrive. Being both Black and a woman in the United States, while full of experiences that can bring joy and connection, can also result in a host of harmful and complicated situations that have to be navigated every day. Dr. Venus Evans Winters is a licensed clinical social worker and has published widely on how social and physical environments shape the well-being of girls and women of color.
living in the body of a Black woman, we're living at the intersections of race and gender, and we're living in systems that uphold racism and institutional or systematic gender bias. And so can you imagine that, right? Just existing at the intersections of race and gender in a society that privileges whiteness, middle class, wealth, as well as masculinity.
So, on top of just sort of those existence experiences, what are the day-to-day things that can kind of add to that weight for Black women?
Imagine your everyday experiences are being surveilled or monitored. So things other people may take for granted, like going to the grocery store. Many of us have been in that situation where we think, okay, here are my eggs, here's my bread, here's my basket of fruit. But you realize that you are being treated differently. We're always in a state of heightened awareness. I remember one time, Kimberly, someone actually asked me, so do you have a link card, which is a form of like a welfare card. But the person right behind me was not asked for this benefit. Now, there's nothing wrong with, food assistance by any means. But imagine being stereotyped as you're that person, but the person behind you maybe not.
What you describe reminds me of how all of these interactions also take on the question, am I having this experience because I'm Black? Am I having this experience because I'm a woman? Or am I overthinking it?
So imagine always policing your own thoughts. So am I hypersensitive? Is it something wrong with me? As opposed to questioning society, as opposed to questioning our conditioning, as opposed to questioning our levels of freedom. Now, to be honest with you, Kimberly, I've been outside the United States in African countries or countries where there are mostly Black people. And I can tell you now, this non-hyper sensitivity, and we're very comfortable. And so we know at some point it's not us. At some point, we know that there is something wrong with race relations in this country, but also gender and how Black women are perceived, the stereotypes of who we are or who we aren't.
Can you talk a bit about the unique role that Black women often play within their communities and how that affects mental health in particular?
We play many roles. So we are the primary caregivers in many of our family situations. Also, Black women are one of the most highly involved, civically involved social groups in the United States. Black women also, imagine when our people are sent off to jails and prisons, we're more likely to bring those people back into our homes. We're also more likely to be taking care of other people's children. So it's almost like we're carrying the weight on our shoulders of not only our own communities, but other people's communities.
Black women may be highly engaged in their communities, but Dr. Evans Winters says carrying all of this can affect the baseline of Black women's mental health.
I think that we are still trying to gather more information on the mental health and well-being of Black women. What we do know is that there's a strong correlation between racism and sexism and Black women's overall mental health. But I also want to understand the long-term consequences to the physical body. So, for example, when we look at Black women from middle age to older age, what we find is that they do have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, even diabetes. And so when we look at the same group of women and we control for other social factors like income, education, what we learn is that the one consistent things in their lives is perceptions of racism. So we're asking, what is this correlation? So one, older Black women are more likely to report feelings of isolation. Older Black women compared to their white female peers are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health issues like anxiety and depression. And so all of these factors can lead to a grieving heart.
This grieving heart, that's quite a way of putting it.
When I think about the grieving heart, imagine walking through life feeling marginalized at work, feeling isolated in schools, even in your neighborhood. But the more we expose ourselves or the more we integrate into society, then the more likely we are to experience racism and sexism. And it impacts our hearts. It impacts our central nervous system. It impacts our mental health.
That was Dr. Venus Evans Winters. You are listening to The Burden of Being, a broadcast special from American Public Media's Call to Mind. I'm Kimberly Adams. The health and well-being of Black women in adulthood can be predicted as early as preschool. In fact, that's true of all Black people of all gender identities. Minnesota Public Radio News reporter Kyra Miles looked at how racism, poverty, and other stressors Black families may experience can impact children's development, and some experts say the biggest factor could be the mental health of the caregiver.
With 3 daughters, Brandon and Monica Jones have their hands full. Their oldest is 10, middle 8, and the youngest is 2-year-old Skylar. Even amidst the slight morning chaos, Monica holds sacred the ritual of doing her daughter's hair. That's why Jones says she'll do her daughter's hair for as long as they let her.
I try to be gentle, though. I try.
She tries.
She knows she only has a few years left doing her oldest's hair. But Jones and her husband have plenty of time with their youngest.
And Peppa Pig, what does Peppa Pig say? Yeah. And what sound does a cow make? Yeah.
Jones says she wants to give her daughters the freedom to share how they feel and move through the world as they want as Black women. In their household, Jones and her husband try to model good self-care techniques.
I'm hoping that because of their exposure and their ability to pull on those techniques, it can help them regulate their emotions and understand the importance of mental health, down the road as they get older.
But that's not always easy. Brandon Jones would know. He leads the Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health, which makes him uniquely adept at noticing things about his daughters as they grow. For young children, their mental health is directly tied to the mental health of their caregiver. And for Black parents, Jones says race adds a different layer of challenges.
A lot of times, Black parents and caregivers feel that they're being judged on their parenting based on our experiences with racism. Even if the judgment's not there, we've been socialized and conditioned to assume the teacher's judging me, my family doctor's judging me.
As a reproductive psychiatrist in Los Angeles, Simi Bamboshe sees how caregivers of Black children, in many cases Black women, can struggle to cope with their mental health problems.
But when someone's struggling with anxiety or depression or PTSD, they're really not able to handle that load and shoulder all of those expectations. And so how does that affect the child? It means that the child is not getting the interaction from their parent that they need to develop and that positive engagement.
Bamboshe says structural racism is a big reason we see these disparities. Black women are 3.5 times more likely to die in pregnancy and almost twice as likely to experience postpartum depression compared to their white counterparts. Bamboshe says Black women and children's health hasn't historically been valued in America, which creates a cycle of neglect.
So it means the child is not learning how to support others emotionally, not learning how to express their own emotions appropriately. And so they're really not equipped to deal with the world.
Willie Garrett has been a licensed psychologist for 43 years. He says children have a strong radar for sensing stress and tension. And while they might not understand the racism or depression their parents are experiencing, they do internalize those feelings.
Some children won't say, I'm unhappy, or I'm sad. They might cry more. They might stay alone more, but they won't say, children don't know to say, I'm depressed. It's up to a parent.
The environment can also be a stressor. Across the United States, Black people live in the highest rates of poverty, according to the census. There are numerous organizations that address medical discrimination and provide resources for families experiencing housing or food instability, but they don't always address the root of these disparities. Eva Marie Shivers founded a cultural center in Phoenix that researches families and children of color. Her work centers an understanding of how racialized generational trauma in the Black community impacts the way kids are parented.
We believe that we are preparing them for a harsh world. We believe that we are protecting them because we love them. And so we need them to understand when I say no, it means no, don't question me. Because when you're out there in the world, even in your little preschool class, if you get out of line, here are the consequences that can happen.
These adaptive strategies of parenting that Shiver says are responding to structures of oppression in some ways still endure today. But Shiver says she sees the infant and early childhood mental health field reaching a tipping point where childhood racial narratives are disrupted and Black caregivers and children are uplifted.
We do a lot of pro-social racialization with our children. All the books that we have, Black is Beautiful. Let's learn about the strong people in our history and our family. Look how beautiful your brown skin is. That's like tapping into our beauty, our joy, our excellence.
That's what Monica Jones does with her daughters.
Oh, it's beautiful. Good job. Let me see. Ooh, pretty girl.
She says her daughters have a strong sisterhood, modeled after the other Black women in their life. Jones and her husband have nightly family dinners and games to bond with their kids and social emotional check-ins. Jones herself is big on self-care.
I'm very conscientious about making sure that I take care of my mental health so that I am able to show up better as a parent.
For things to continue evolving, Shiver says there needs to be a stronger pipeline of Black physicians, Black nurses, therapists, and doulas into communities to create a holistic network that supports Black families and the women in them. For Call to Mind, I'm Kyra Miles from NPR News.
I'm a 19-year-old from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is a very conservative state. And so growing up there wasn't exactly easy. I went to a very predominantly white school all the way from kindergarten to graduation of high school. And as a younger kid, it wasn't entirely easy, mainly because younger kids in elementary school don't exactly have a filter. So they say a lot of things, and they do mean it. But it did really cause a lot of strain with just being secure within myself. But I do feel that growing up, I've become a lot more content with myself and a lot more secure with myself because I know that it's not my looks that define me. It's mainly my character, my personality. And I do have a lot of aspiring things about myself that I'm very proud of.
That was Yasmin from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Her story about being treated differently at school and with peers is pretty common for Black girls. I went to a predominantly white school and can remember lining up for class in the morning, proud of my cute pigtails, only to be teased about my hair texture because it was different from the other kids. I remember being called the N-word for the first time by another child at age 7. It's not just conflicts on the playground. Black girls are often treated differently by adults at school. Compared to white girls in their classes, Black girls are 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled. They are arrested at school at much higher rates compared to white girls, and that starts in elementary school. Meanwhile, they're the fastest growing population in the juvenile justice system. The Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality released a study in 2020 called Girlhood Interrupted. For the first time, the report shared data on how adults viewed Black girls. The participants in the study were people from all over the United States, from different educational backgrounds, and representing various ethnic and racial groups. The study focused on what experts call adultification bias, the idea that some girls are viewed as more adult-like than girls of other races. The study findings confirmed Black girls as young as 5 years old were perceived to be older than they were. But a key question from this study about adultification bias is how does it impact the well-being and lives of Black girls? Logan Green is a 19-year-old college student at the University of Mississippi. In 2021, she won the National Speech and Debate Competition in the original spoken word category for her poem, Reclaiming Girlhood. Her piece describes moments of adultification that Black girls experience.
I was 9 years old walking alone when I heard the voice of a man. Where you going? How old are you? I was frightened, scared, so I ran until I reached home, grabbed my phone to tell my uncle what happened. What were you wearing? You know you look grown. Grown, grown, grown as I stand here before you today. Know that this is a protest. Know that my body, black and beautiful and worthy in every way, remains a vessel. For the black girls who were taken too soon by the ones who swore to protect us. For the black girls who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. For the black girls who were arrested when they needed help. For the black girls who were assaulted because their hips grew too wide and breasts too large too soon.
When did you first hear about the idea of adultification bias?
I knew that Black girls were experiencing discriminations because of their race and gender, but I wasn't really conscious of how strongly it played a factor in our lives. I had never heard of adultification bias before. And when I learned of adultification bias, it was as if a light bulb went off in my head and made me aware of what I was experiencing growing up.
Was there a particular moment it took you back to as you were reading through it?
When I was around 9 years old and this adult man would hit on me and I would tell him my age and he didn't believe me because he said that I was too developed to be that young. And when I would go to my family and tell them the things that this man was saying, they bombarded me with questions about what I was potentially doing wrong. So instead of protecting me, they were blaming me. I noticed that a lot of my peers deal with the emotional labor of adultification bias. Black girls are expected to provide emotional support and guidance to their household at a very young age. Now that I'm older and that I'm living on my own, I see how much of that I've internalized. And I have to continuously remind myself and them that we're still young and we're still learning, and it's okay not to be in control and have everything in order all the time.
Black girls aren't given the privilege of youth. Youth protects from consequences that were made because you didn't know better. Black girls can't learn from the mistakes that were made because we were taught not to make them. You have to be twice as good as them to get half of what they have, so my grandmother would rock back and forth in her chair with the look of pride in her face as my mother whipped a page out of Master's book, How to Train a Black Girl. The basics. 1, don't be loud or you're ghetto. 2, don't say no or you're problematic. 3, don't be passionate or you're angry. 4, don't switch your hips or you're too fast. 5, don't fight because who will protect you?
That was an excerpt of Logan Green's award-winning poem, Reclaiming Girlhood. She was inspired by the 2020 report, Girlhood Interrupted. Rebecca Epstein is the executive director of the Center on Gender Justice and Opportunity at the Georgetown University Law Center. She was the lead author on the study. That research provided some real data to much of what Logan experienced. The surveyed adults assumed Black girls were less innocent, needed less nurturing or protection, and that they could better handle adult roles and responsibilities. Rebecca explained it's tough to pinpoint the exact trigger for the adultification bias of Black girls, but the roots could be traced to socially imposed roles that Black women were expected to play.
So the stereotypes that I think all of us are familiar with, Black women being angry, being threatening, being perceived as hypersexualized, are being projected onto Black girls. And we're seeing these ripple effects of Black girls much more easily being seen to be all of those things: angry, threatening, hypersexualized.
Walk me through how this adultification bias might show up in an interaction between, say, a white adult and a Black little girl.
Well, consider a judge who has a Black girl in front of them. If a judge is looking at a Black girl and what they see in their mind's eye is sort of a miniature adult, that judge is more likely to hold the child to a higher standard, less likely to have compassion for that child or grant them leniency in the way that our culture does with children every day. Black girls' innocence is essentially robbed when an adult looks at them and treats them as if they're an adult. It can also show up in school in the form of harsher school discipline. We know from many studies that Black girls are punished at far higher rates than any other group except Black boys.
I'm looking at some of this data where you found in your report that compared to white girls of the same age, people saw Black girls as needing less nurturing, less protection, less support, less comfort, that they were more independent, even that they knew more about adult topics like sex. And I'm just thinking that's a lot to put on a child.
That's exactly right. And one of the things we were surprised by was that this discrepancy in perception of innocence didn't only occur in the teenage years, where you maybe might expect it with the onset of puberty and adolescence, but it really reached back through all of girlhood for Black girls. The discrepancy in how adults view Black girls was at its greatest in the age group of 10 to 14 years old, and it was at its second greatest in the age group of 5 to 9 years old.
I'm thinking about the consequences in the educational setting for Black girls being viewed as more adult, as more mature. What happens when then there's an overlap of police being in schools?
That's such an important question. And most often, the lens that's turned on the school to prison pipeline is about boys, when we know that Black girls are also experiencing such higher rates of arrest in school. And that's a direct line from school into the juvenile justice system.
During our research, we asked Rebecca and others from the mental health treatment field about the long-term consequences of adultification of Black girls. Those consequences can include higher risk of physical abuse, vulnerability to sex trafficking, and harsher punishments for misbehavior. All of the experts we spoke to confirmed there can be harmful effects on both a girl's mental and physical health, and these experiences showed up later in their lives. We asked Rebecca what needs to change to allow Black girls to just live as girls in this country.
We need to train our doctors, our police, our judges, and our teachers on adultification bias, and we need to give them concrete tools to overcome their own implicit bias to reduce this form of harm against Black girls. I have found that many adults who learn about adultification bias recognize it in themselves and say, I can remember times, many times, when I looked at a Black girl and thought she was older. And awareness in itself can lead to change, but we also need to really be developing anti-bias tools for all adults who have authority over the trajectory of Black girls' lives to treat them in an age-appropriate, trauma-informed way.
Maybe it's obvious, but what gives you hope for the future of Black girls?
Girls give me the most hope about the future of Black girls.
As I stand here before you today, know that this is a protest. Know that my body, Black and beautiful and worthy in every way, remains a vessel for all the Black girls, for every Black girl. I see you.
Logan Green was made the inaugural youth storyteller in residence at the Center of Gender Justice and Opportunity at the Georgetown University Law Center. Visit our program page at calltomindnow.org to find Logan's poetry and the full Girlhood Interrupted report. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll hear from two Black therapists about what they hear from the women they work with. That's coming up on The Burden of Being, a Call to Mind special from American Public Media. Welcome back to The Burden of Being, a broadcast special from Call to Mind, American Public Media's initiative to foster new conversations about mental health. I'm Kimberly Adams.
Even though I have never in my lifetime had any serious interaction with the police, I'm scared to death about what would happen if someone called the police on me as I walk through my neighborhood. I mean, I often think of strategies for how to navigate that situation. What will I say? What will I do? What's my alibi? Who will I call? It's something that I think about a lot. And it stresses me out because walking around is not a crime.
That was Hadia from River Forest, Illinois. Here in Washington, D.C., on a Saturday morning, two Black mental health providers joined me for tea and conversation in our studio. Jamila Khani, a clinical social worker at True Inheritance Therapy and Whitman Walker Health, and Zena White, a licensed graduated professional counselor at Return to Self Therapy and Washington Psychological Wellness. Both women are fairly early in their careers and operate private practices with an emphasis on the needs of Black clients. They told me they hear from their clients who are Black women about their concerns for their families and communities and about their struggles with their own self-worth and self-esteem. These might sound like challenges anyone of any race or gender can struggle with, so I asked them to explain what makes these concerns different for Black women specifically. Zena started with systemic oppression.
For example, like being raised as a Black woman, being raised as a dark-skinned woman in particular, there was some conditioning that you have to accept what is given to you. So, you go to the doctor and the doctor said, you tell the doctor, I'm in pain. And the doctor says, you're not in pain. Go take some pain meds. You are taught to accept that. You're not taught to challenge, to push back. Because anyhow you challenge or push back as a Black person, it's going to be 20 times worse for you.
Yeah, and I would even say the safety piece of like conditioning and programming and that generational trauma where learning it is unsafe for me to speak up, for me to say what I need, for me to disagree. So there has to be this reprogramming of like, oh, I do have value, I have worth that is separate from what I can do for other people in my service to other people. And like, it's safe for me to kind of claim that space for myself and to figure out who am I and what do I want and what is fulfilling and enjoyable for me.
I wonder if you can walk me through what it is about the day-to-day lived experiences of Black women in particular that has an impact on our mental health and well-being.
The way that we are expected to show up in society, in the world, what's projected to us about us, comparing yourself. Like there's a constant need to compare yourself, compare the type of Black woman that you are, compare the class of the Black woman that you are. Are you the Black woman that is the professional with several degrees now? Or are you the Black woman that still has a husband or doesn't? There's just so many different ways to be. And I don't think we are at a place yet we're to be expansive in the ways that we are. I don't think Black women are one thing. I think whiteness is a standard that we are always, in some ways, form or fashion, like assimilating to. So all that to say, the day-to-day, I think, probably is heavier on comparing yourself to the standard or the expectations that have always been around.
We're a group of Black women, and part of that shared language is our ability to kind of easily identify microaggressions, right? And I wonder how often you're experiencing racism and the microaggressions and how that shows up in conversations with your clients.
I think most recently I probably experienced in my personal life, like people challenging my career or challenging my degree It's very common for people to ask what you do, and I'll tell them. And then there's a switch that says for them to challenge me. Do you have the degree or the license for this? What type of counseling are you doing? Seeing the populations that I see, this is like a common note where even as a therapist, I relate to that so much, or I've had that exact same experience. It's unfortunate. It shouldn't be like the microaggressions uniting us. But at the same time, it's kind of like, I'm glad that I can actually be a face for people that look like me that are experiencing these same things without, maybe them going to another person that is from a different background. And those people may be challenging if it was even a microaggression because they don't have that lived experience.
A lot of the Black women who I work with are professionals, very high-ranking, degreed. And so these are conversations that we often have in terms of me supporting them in regards to like navigating microaggression. I don't even know if it's micro. Sometimes it's just aggression.
I was just going to say, like, microaggressions, sometimes they're just aggression, like you said. But I also feel like microaggressions are so manipulative. It almost is like, it's like gaslighting in a way because it's like you have to question if you are overreacting because it's so small, but at the same time, you're the only person experience it. You can't talk to other people at work for real because they may not see the same things if you're the only Black person on the team.
It's like, is this racism or are they just rude?
Yeah, what is happening?
How often do you hear from your clients concerns or anxiety or fear of the criminal justice system or interactions with law enforcement?
Very, very often. This could be ticket violations or domestic issues and how that's handled by law enforcement. There's a lot of anxiety and fear because of just the relationship and how things have been with the justice system and being Black or being a person of color. It's difficult because that's another shared traumatic experience that I can kind of relate to on a personal level with them. It's people having panic attacks for a cop being behind them or anxiety being like through the roof based on a traumatic experience that they've seen, witnessed, or in some cases have family that have issues with law enforcement in the past.
I think in my experience, it often comes up in regards to access to mental health care, especially like crisis. Because if you're in a mental health crisis and you're wanting intervention, oftentimes the police will get involved or be involved. And so if there is that concern, if there is that fear, then that might prevent someone from requesting crisis intervention because they're like, oh, the police are going to show up at my door and I don't trust the police.
Yeah.
We really struggled to come up with a title for this program about Black women and mental health care. And we landed on The Burden of Being.
I like that. I like that.
Why?
Because I think that describes our experience perfectly. It's like you are a problem because you are existing. And that is something that I think I was also raised to believe and understand too in my lived experience, being like a dark-skinned Black woman, being a Black woman with parents from the Caribbean. Like there was just so much like life is going to be hard and you have to work harder and you need to be perfect, feminine. There were just so many ladylike, yes, I can keep going. So there was just so many rules and expectations set on me that I remember being at 6, like, I'm exhausted. This is draining.
For me, I felt that like it definitely hit hard, that title. And I think that is one of the struggles and the limitations of therapy, right? It's like if somebody's saying like, oh, racism. And you're like, here's a coping strategy. Take some deep breaths.
Just breathe deeply.
Yeah.
It'll be okay.
And this whole, burden of being. It's like, damn, I don't really have a solution for that. Like I can hold, and that in itself has a power of like, I see you. I'm validating your experience. I'm holding space for you to just like vent and just talk about your frustrations. And that can be really hard and can be draining when it's like, I don't have a solution for you.
You are listening to The Burden of Being, a broadcast special from Call to Mind. I'm Kimberly Adams.
My youngest is 19, and I worry about him being in school so far away. I have conversations with him regularly where I'm asking how he's doing, but really what I want to ask is, how are you faring mentally? Do you feel the burden of the world yet in your very small, isolated, private university? I am also a mother of a young woman. She is Muslim, not just culturally, but actively practicing in the Western world. She has assigned herself as a moving mark. The stress is more than I can share. But I guess this is where my faith kicks in, and I have to believe that she is protected, that she will be safe.
That was Jamila. She lives in South Fulton, Georgia, one of many women we heard from for this show. In many ways, Susan Burton's life story describes the burden of being. Susan grew up in a housing project in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts. She survived an incredibly tough childhood, which included sexual abuse and violence in her home. Her book, Becoming Miss Burton, shares her personal story about living through these traumas while coming out on the other side with hope. She has a passion for helping formerly incarcerated women reroute their lives. Susan says a tragic loss triggered her long battle with substance use disorders. KK was Susan's 5-year-old son. He died while playing outside, hit by a police car. Susan says that accident ignited unbearable pain.
The level of grief and hurt that I felt was more than I could bear. And there were no resources. There was no grief counseling. I didn't know what to do, and I began to drink. And I drank to drown the pain, and it escalated to drug use. And I was incarcerated for the drug use. There was rage, there was hurt, there was, the emotions of grief. Still today, I think about what could have happened and what should have happened. But instead, what did happen is that my substance use and alcoholism was criminalized, and I was sent to prison. And, I stayed in the criminal justice system for 2 decades.
Susan cycled in and out of prison 6 times on drug-related charges. After she was released, her only option was to go home to the same neighborhood where many of her problems waited, and then slowly the cycle would start over. Susan said she never had access to support resources for her substance use problems, and multiple incarcerations did not get to the root of the problem.
Prison is not the right solution for people with substance use disorders. It's not the right solution for people with mental health diagnoses. It just exacerbates the problem. I think a disinvestment in resources in our communities are the root of problems. I think the overinvestment in law enforcement, the disinvestment in mental health resources and treatment options or opportunities is the root of our problems of mass incarceration in our communities. Had there been a place that I could have went for grief counseling, I wouldn't have had to turn there.
Incarceration disproportionately impacts Black communities. One study found that Black people are 4 times as likely as their white peers to be sent to jail. We often hear about how incarceration affects Black men, but not as much about Black women. I asked Susan for her take on that.
The underinvestment in Black girls and Black women is startling and it's harmful. So my question is what about Black women and Black girls? Don't we deserve attention, support, investment, and love?
Susan runs a nonprofit organization called A New Way of Life. It's a reentry project for recently incarcerated women that provides housing, case management, and free legal services. Many of the clients are women of color. About 30% of incarcerated women in the U.S. are Black. And the time after they're released from jail or prison is a pivotal moment. Some succeed at finding a new start in life, others don't. One of the first challenges a woman released from prison faces is, where is she going to live? And the answer is not always simple. That's one of the reasons Susan Burton created the Safe Housing Network for formerly incarcerated women. Burton started the network in 2018, and there are now more than 30 locations across the U.S. and several in Africa. Stephanie Hughes of Marketplace went to visit one of them.
At the Lilac House in Westchester County, New York, one resident in particular gets a lot of attention.
Fiona Marie.
I can't believe she got a middle name.
She has to. My Fiona Marie.
Fiona, middle name Marie, is a small dog with short gray and brown hair. And the Lilac House's executive director, Pamela Zimba, is chastising her for trying to get upstairs.
Fiona, boundaries.
She said no.
Boundaries.
Fiona, along with the black and white cat Jinx, greeted 23-year-old Tasha Cruz when she first arrived here, after being released from prison about 10 days ago.
And then I saw them interact, and I'm like, oh my God, that is so good. Like, you know, sometimes cats and dogs don't get along, and they act like little brother and sister.
Cruz went to prison for assault for over 3 years. She says if she hadn't gotten a spot here, she would likely have ended up in a homeless shelter. But she didn't want just shelter. She wanted a home.
I just feel like it's a safe place. When you hear, like, you're okay. You don't feel like you're under pressure. You just feel comfortable.
One of Cruz's housemates is 52-year-old Shantae Diaz. She also just arrived 10 days ago after spending 7 weeks in prison for violating probation. She'd originally been sentenced in connection with a bank robbery. She says being here gives her the structure that she wouldn't have if she were living with people she knew.
They're still doing the same thing that they would do and expect you to do the same. And I can't. I'm too old.
Diaz says being here is kind of like living with sisters.
You're learning more of what it is to have a family, a positive family as opposed to a negative one.
That's exactly what Pamela Zimba was going for when she opened the Lilac House in March of 2023. She spent 6 years in prison herself for burglary, and when she was released in 2018, she landed in the shelter system.
Literally, it was like walking right back into the prison. The whole setup of it, the beds were the same, the mattress was the same.
Even the shower was the same.
You push a button and the water comes on and it cuts off after like 60 seconds.
Zimba says she still felt institutionalized, and she didn't have access to cleaning supplies or clothes or hygiene products, all of which formerly incarcerated women need if they're going to successfully reintegrate into society.
I think that's the first time in my life I realized why people end up reoffending and going back to prison.
Zimba wants to provide others the support that she didn't get. So she got a grant through the Safe Housing Network, whose founder, Susan Burton, bought this property so Zimba could create the Lilac House.
Walking into a space like this makes people a lot more calm, less anxiety.
It's really cozy here. The television sits above a fake fireplace. There's an orange teapot on the dining room table and a whiff of French toast in the kitchen. Zimba lives here too. She cooks every night, and she's there for any questions, which resident Tasha Cruz says is super helpful.
I could pull up on her like, can I talk to you? Or can you help me with this? Like, she lived here with us, so it's not like I have to text her or wait 2 days to see her or anything. I could see her on the spot.
There are rules. Curfew is 10 p.m. during the week, 11 on the weekend. No significant others in the house. No drugs or alcohol. But there's also freedom. The women can eat whenever they want, watch television whenever they want. Resident Shantae Diaz says it's a relief after living in prison.
It does mess with your mental health. The noises, the cell closing at night, how they treat you. You know, they flash a light in your eye every half hour when you're sleeping.
Now that she's living at the Lilac House, Diaz is enrolled in a computer course. She also has access to a counselor and occasionally goes to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. She says her goal is to become a peer advocate and help young people who've gotten into trouble.
I'm an auntie to everybody, so I might as well, put that to good use.
All 3 residents living here right now are women of color. 2 of them identify as Black. Zimba does too. And she says race adds an extra challenge for formerly incarcerated women.
The stereotype is there for formerly incarcerated people, but for some reason I think it hits a little harder when you're a person of color.
Zimba connects the women with whatever they need: counseling, anger management classes, even parenting and financial literacy help. Still, the Lilac House isn't for everyone.
I feel like in the beginning I was just saying yes to anybody.
Then, a couple residents started using drugs again. They ended up leaving of their own accord. But Zimba realized she wasn't equipped to help people with serious substance use disorder or other serious mental illnesses.
Something like that would take more of like, you need full-time staff, and we don't have that. So it's not going to work here.
Zimba says she looks for residents who have goals, whether it's starting school or getting a job. Women can stay here for up to 2 years, and they're supposed to take their time getting settled, which resident Tasha Cruz appreciates.
Your main thing in your head is, I can't go back. But if you're not taking care of your mental health, you're going to end up back.
Cruz started writing books during the years she was in prison. Her goal is to get one of them published. She feels like this is a good launching pad for her to do that.
You see how in certain environments a plant cannot grow? You can grow here. The soil is good for you here.
Right now, the Lilac House only accepts women on their own. But Zimba wants to expand and have other houses for women with families, disabilities, trans women, and trans men.
Because the worst thing is asking, hey, do you have availability, and have to say no.
As far as Zimba knows, none of the residents who've lived here have returned to prison. She says ultimately she wants to be able to offer permanent housing so she can give more recently incarcerated women the tools they need and the opportunity to thrive for as long as they'd like. For Call to Mind, I'm Stephanie Hughes from Marketplace.
It's going to take more than safe housing to truly relieve the burden of being for Black girls and women, including equitable communities with fewer barriers to economic and social advancement. Black women have historically relied on each other to create safe spaces of support. But to expand those spaces, the people around them, Black men, white folks, all people, can work on their own prejudices, their own indifference, and how they contribute to the burden of being. You've been listening to The Burden of Being, a broadcast special from Call to Mind, American Public Media's initiative to foster new conversations about mental health. We'd like to thank every woman who shared their stories with us for this show. This program wouldn't be possible without your voices and experiences. Support for this program is provided by the Sozo Say Foundation and the David and Laura Lovell Foundation. This program was produced and written by our senior producer, Jessica Bari, and edited by Stephen Smith. Our technical director is Alex Simpson. Chris Julin, Annika Best, and Nancy Rosenbaum provided production support. A special thank you to Noya Carr for additional editing. And this show was hosted by me, Kimberly Adams. Follow Call to Mind on our social channels at Call to Mind Now, and find resources and all of our past programs on our website at calltomindnow.org. Thank you for joining us for The Burden of Being, a broadcast special by Call to Mind from American Public Media.